3:47 a.m., 3 Russian facilities, 1,200 kilometers from where they launched. By the time air defense crews realized what had hit them, the missiles were already gone. This is the story of the first combat night of Ukraine's Flamingo cruise missile, a weapon most Western analysts insisted Kyiv couldn't field at this range, not yet, and definitely not against 3 hardened targets in one coordinated strike. I'm your host at War Vector, where we break down the battles that change wars. Tonight, how a low-flying missile nobody in Moscow's command centers expected slipped through a radar gap that Ukrainian planners had spent weeks quietly mapping. By the end of this video, you'll understand how the targeting cell built this operation, why the gap in Russian radar coverage existed, and what happened inside Russian command nets in the minutes after impact. Intercepted communications from that night tell a story Moscow never wanted made public. Real tactics, real consequences. War Vector, December 2025. A classified Ukrainian strike cell, designation withheld in open-source reporting, had been tracking a problem for 9 weeks. 3 targets, an industrial complex feeding components into Russia's missile production chain, a satellite relay node passing targeting data to Russian strike packages over the Donbass, and a fuel depot supplying armor formations preparing for a winter push near Kupiansk. All 3 sat more than 1,200 kilometers from any Ukrainian launch position that conventional systems could reach. HIMARS couldn't touch them. Storm Shadow, with its roughly 250-kilometer range, couldn't touch them either. Only one platform in Ukraine's arsenal had the legs for this: the Flamingo, a domestically produced long-range cruise missile that Ukrainian defense officials had unveiled publicly only months earlier. With a stated range exceeding 3,000 kilometers and a 1,150-kilogram warhead, one of the heaviest payloads carried by any cruise missile currently in service anywhere. What's most surprising about this case isn't the missile. It's the patience behind the strike. 3 months spent mapping a single gap in Russian integrated air defense, just to use it once, perfectly, before it closed forever. The strategic logic was simple and brutal. Russia's air defense network along its western and southern approaches had been built, layer by layer, to intercept one kind of threat: the slow, low-altitude, propeller-driven Shahed 136 drones that Ukraine's western corridor had absorbed by the thousand since 2023. Panzer batteries, S-300 and S-400 systems, mobile gun platforms, all of it calibrated and waiting for that familiar buzzing signature on radar. Russian air defense crews along the corridor had grown accustomed to a rhythm. Shaheds came in waves, predictable altitude bands, predictable approach vectors. Crews intercepted what they could, let the rest get chewed up by jamming and decoys, and went back to their tents. Ukrainian intelligence had been watching that rhythm too. Somewhere in the gaps between radar sweep cycles, in the blind spots created by terrain masking near a cluster of low ridgelines south of the primary coverage zone, Ukrainian planners found a seam. We dug through months of open-source radar coverage analysis and Ukrainian General Staff statements to piece together what we could verify. Here's what didn't make the front-page coverage. The gap wasn't accidental. It existed because the terrain made radar coverage genuinely difficult to maintain there, and Russian commanders had assessed, correctly under normal threat conditions, that the area posed low risk against drones. Nobody had stress-tested it against a missile flying low, fast, on a flight profile built specifically to hug that exact terrain feature for nearly 40 kilometers of its approach. Analysts who later reviewed the terrain data noted something else. The ridgeline that created the blind spot wasn't even particularly remarkable on a standard topographic map. It's the kind of feature any planner could overlook, unless they were specifically hunting for radar shadow zones, which is exactly what the Ukrainian targeting cell had spent 9 weeks doing. Cross-referencing elevation models against known radar emplacement coordinates until the seam revealed itself. This wasn't a battle. This was the execution of a plan 9 weeks in the making. The targeting officers, 3 of them, working from a hardened command post whose location remains undisclosed, finalized launch windows under brutal time pressure. A single radar lock on a Flamingo during transit, even a fleeting one, could compromise this strike and the entire mapped gap for every future operation along that corridor. One mistake, and Russia patches the hole. 3 months of work, gone in the time it takes an operator to flag an anomalous return. I spent hours going through the available reporting on this operation, and one detail kept nagging me. The missiles weren't all launched from the same window. Ukrainian planners staggered the 3 launches by roughly 40 minutes each, timing the strikes so all 3 would arrive on target within an 11-minute span. Close enough to overwhelm any coordinated Russian response, spaced enough that a single ground-based radar operator working triple duty across multiple screens would have to process 3 near-simultaneous low-altitude contacts arriving from different bearings. 3:11 a.m. The first Flamingo cleared its launch position and dropped to a cruise altitude Ukrainian officials have described publicly as low enough to exploit terrain masking. Analysts estimate under 100 meters across much of its flight path, though exact figures remain classified. Subsonic, around 900 kilometers per hour according to publicly stated specifications. At that speed and altitude, the missile would spend nearly 80 minutes in transit before reaching its first target, the industrial complex. 20 minutes before the first launch, a complication. A routine Russian patrol aircraft, a fixed-wing reconnaissance asset on a scheduled sortie, completely unrelated to the strike cell's operation, adjusted its flight path and began loitering near the edge of the mapped radar gap. Coincidence, but the kind of coincidence that could have ended the entire operation before it began. If that aircraft's onboard sensors picked up unusual ground activity near the launch staging area, the mission was finished. The targeting cell had no contingency for this. There was no abort signal that wouldn't itself risk exposing the operation. The senior targeting officer made the call. Proceed. 23 minutes later, the patrol aircraft banked away and resumed its scheduled route. It never came within visual or radar range of the launch site. The window held. The column stopped. No, wait. There was no column yet. That comes later, in the aftermath, when Russian recovery and damage control vehicles converge on 3 burning sites at once. Right now there's only the missile, climbing briefly out of its terrain-hugging profile to clear a ridge, then dropping back down. Engine note steady. Navigation system correcting for wind drift, using a combination of satellite positioning and inertial guidance that Ukrainian engineers built specifically to function in contested electronic warfare environments. A lesson learned the hard way, from earlier long-range strikes where Russian jamming had degraded GPS-dependent munitions mid-flight. Subscribe to War Vector if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. Which mattered more, in breaching Russia's deepest air defense ring, the missile's range or the months of patient reconnaissance that found the gap in the first place? Comment below. Inside the fuel depot's perimeter, roughly 90 minutes before impact, a conscript on overnight watch logged a routine entry in the depot's duty book. Temperatures steady, fuel truck traffic light. Nothing unusual to report. He had no way of knowing the facility he was guarding had already been selected, mapped, and scheduled for destruction weeks earlier by a targeting cell he would never know existed. His logbook entry would later become one of the small human details Ukrainian intelligence analysts cited when reconstructing the timeline of that night. Proof that even hours before impact, the target believed itself ordinary, unremarkable, safe. 3:51 a.m. The second Flamingo launched, bound for the satellite relay node. Its flight path diverged from the first missiles by nearly 30 degrees, designed to approach from a separate bearing, so Russian air defense wouldn't see a single, easily tracked axis of attack. If Russian operators picked up the first missile somewhere along its route, the second and third needed to look like an unrelated event, not a coordinated follow-up. 4:31 a.m. The third missile launched, bound for the fuel depot, the target closest to active Russian armor staging, and, for that reason, the one Ukrainian planners considered most time-sensitive. Intelligence reports had flagged increased fuel truck traffic at the depot over the preceding 10 days, consistent with preparations for a renewed push toward Kupiansk. Hit the depot before that fuel disperses into forward staging areas, and you don't just destroy stockpiled diesel, you delay an offensive. Here's what nobody expected. Russian air defense crews along the corridor picked up exactly nothing for the first 71 minutes of the operation. Not a flicker. Not an anomalous return worth flagging. The terrain masking worked precisely as Ukrainian planners had calculated it would. The first sign of trouble for Russian command came not from radar, but from the industrial complex itself. A low rumble felt before it was heard, then the unmistakable concussion of a 1,150-kilogram warhead detonating against a structure never designed to survive anything heavier than artillery fragmentation. Satellite imagery analysis conducted in the days following the strike showed the primary production hall reduced to a collapsed steel skeleton. Secondary fires spreading through adjacent storage structures for nearly 6 hours before being brought under control. 4:32 a.m. 1 minute after the third missile launched, the first impact occurred. Russian command nets, intercepted communications indicate, initially assumed an internal accident, a transformer fault, a fuel line rupture. Nobody, in the first 90 seconds, considered the possibility that this was an external strike, because external strikes against this facility, at this distance from any Ukrainian-held territory, simply weren't supposed to be possible. Put yourself in the shoes of the Russian duty officer at that air defense command post for a second. You've spent your entire deployment watching for slow drones along a predictable corridor. Your screens show nothing, and yet a facility 1,200 kilometers from the front line is now burning. What do you even report up the chain? That you don't know what hit you? The industrial complex was burning. The warhead had done its job, and for a few minutes, Russian command believed it was dealing with an isolated accident. They had no idea 2 more missiles were already inbound, and the second one would hit something that made the silence in their communications even worse. How many distinct radar contacts did Russian air defense register across the entire operation before the first impact? A. 0. B. 3. But misclassified as birds. C. 1. Flagged too late to act on. Answer at the end. 4:39 a.m. The second Flamingo struck the satellite relay node. This target mattered beyond its immediate destruction. The relay node had been feeding targeting and communications data to Russian strike packages operating against Ukrainian positions in the Donbass for months. A link in the chain that helped coordinate glide bomb strikes, artillery spotting, and drone reconnaissance across a wide stretch of frontline territory. Knock it out, even temporarily, and you don't just destroy hardware, you introduce friction into every Russian fire mission relying on that data path for days, possibly weeks, while backup systems spin up. Combat footage verification, drawn from satellite thermal imagery released in subsequent open-source analysis, shows the relay node's primary antenna array engulfed within seconds of impact, with secondary explosions consistent with backup generator fuel stores, igniting roughly 4 minutes later. Ukrainian sources estimate the facility would need a minimum of 3 weeks to restore even partial operational capacity, based on the visible extent of structural damage. Here's what this tells us about how this war has evolved. For the first 2 years, Ukraine's long-range strike capability was almost entirely dependent on what Western partners were willing to authorize and supply. And willing was always the operative word, freighted with political caution about escalation. The Flamingo is something different, a domestically engineered system Kyiv can build, launch, and employ on its own targeting priorities, without waiting on a foreign government's approval cable. That shift, more than any single strike, is the real story here. Russian command, in the minutes following the second impact, began to understand they had a coordinated problem rather than 2 isolated incidents. Intercepted communications from this window, released in fragments by Ukrainian intelligence in the days after the strike, capture a tone shifting fast from confusion to alarm. One officer reportedly asked, over an unsecured channel, whether the strikes originated from aircraft, ballistic missiles, or something neither side had previously observed in this sector. Nobody on that channel had an answer. Nobody would have one for hours. 4:42 a.m. The third Flamingo struck the fuel depot. This was the most visually dramatic of the three impacts. A 1,150-kilogram warhead detonating among an estimated several thousand cubic meters of stored diesel and fuel additives produced a fireball that satellite thermal sensors registered from low orbit and that residents in nearby towns reported seeing as a glow on the horizon kilometers away. The depot's loss wasn't just material damage. It directly delayed whatever offensive timeline Russian armor formations near Kupiansk had been working toward. Fuel doesn't materialize instantly. Replacing thousands of cubic meters of stockpiled diesel, rerouting supply convoys, rebuilding storage capacity. Ukrainian military analysts estimated the disruption would set back forward staging by a minimum of 2 to 3 weeks. 3 targets, 3 impacts, 11 minutes between first and last. 0 Ukrainian losses, no aircraft risked, no personnel inside Russian-controlled territory, no exposure beyond the missiles themselves. In a secure facility hundreds of kilometers from any of the 3 strike sites, a small team of Ukrainian imagery analysts spent the following 36 hours processing raw satellite passes, cross-referencing thermal signatures against pre-strike baseline imagery to build the damage assessment that would eventually go to senior defense officials. The work was unglamorous and exacting, measuring the spread of secondary fires, estimating structural collapse percentages, flagging which sections of each facility might still be salvageable. It was this kind of methodical, after-the-fact verification, as much as the missiles themselves, that let Ukraine later state with confidence exactly how badly each target had been degraded. There's a detail in the after-action characterization of this strike that stuck with me. Ukrainian officials, in public statements following the operation, were notably restrained, confirming the strikes occurred and the general categories of targets hit, but withholding the specific terrain masking technique, the radar gap, and the exact staggering of launch windows. That restraint wasn't an accident. It preserved the gap for future use. Moscow now knows, in broad terms, what happened. What Moscow doesn't know yet is exactly how to close the hole that made it possible. And here's the part most coverage of this strike missed entirely. This wasn't a one-time demonstration. Ukrainian defense officials have stated publicly that Flamingo production is scaling, with monthly output figures climbing into double digits, and a stated ambition to go significantly higher through 2026. If that scaling holds, this night wasn't the exception. It was the template. If you believe tactics win wars, type war vector in the comments. In the hours after the strike, Russian air defense units along the corridor scrambled to reassess. Mobile radar assets were repositioned. Additional Pantsir batteries reportedly redeployed toward the previously underdefended terrain gap within 48 hours. A direct, reactive acknowledgement that the scene Ukrainian planners had spent 9 weeks mapping was now compromised, at least for any future operation using an identical flight profile. This is the unglamorous, iterative reality of modern warfare. You find a gap, you use it once, perfectly. The enemy closes it, you go find the next one. Here's the take that'll probably get us flack. This strike succeeded less because of the missile's technical specifications, and more because of institutional patience. 9 weeks of reconnaissance that a less disciplined command structure would have rushed. Plenty of militaries have long-range strike capability. Fewer have the operational patience to sit on a perfect opportunity for months, instead of burning it the moment it becomes available. That patience, not the warhead size or the range figure, is the real differentiator here. Unpopular opinion maybe, but worth saying. Russian air defense doctrine along this corridor was too rigid, too locked onto a single threat profile, for an organization that had been fighting an adaptive enemy for nearly 4 years by this point. A force that watched its opponent repeatedly innovate, naval drones, FPV swarms, Now long-range cruise missiles built domestically under wartime conditions shouldn't still be calibrating its primary air defense posture around the threat it faced 18 months earlier. That's not a tactical failure on the night of the strike. That's a doctrinal failure that predates it by months. Was Russia's reliance on a single predictable threat response pattern the deeper failure here? Or was the radar gap simply an unavoidable consequence of difficult terrain that any military would have struggled to fully cover? What do you think? Did Russian command underestimate Ukraine's domestic missile program? Or did they just run out of resources to cover every possible vector after years of attrition? We read every comment. The fires at all three sites were under control by morning. Russian recovery crews began the grim work of assessing the damage, photographing wreckage, drafting reports that would eventually climb the chain to Moscow. What none of them knew, in those exhausted early hours, was that Ukrainian satellite reconnaissance was already analyzing their own recovery efforts, gathering exactly the kind of damage assessment data that would confirm, days later, just how badly the strike had succeeded. By midday, Ukrainian General Staff issued a brief, carefully worded statement confirming successful long-range strikes against 3 military-industrial targets using domestically produced precision munitions. No mention of the word Flamingo in the initial release. No mention of the radar gap. Just confirmation. Targets hit, objectives achieved. Western defense analysts spent the following 48 hours scrambling to reconcile satellite imagery with Ukraine's stated capability claims. Several had publicly doubted, in commentary published only weeks earlier, that the Flamingo program had matured to a point where it could reliably strike targets at this range, with this level of precision. Satellite imagery analysis confirmed otherwise. 3 precise impacts, minimal collateral scatter, consistent with a guided munition rather than an unguided long-range rocket. Western-supplied systems had carried much of Ukraine's long-range strike burden for the better part of 3 years. Storm Shadow, Scalp, Attack Sims, variants when politically authorized, each came bundled with the diplomatic friction of asking a foreign government for permission to use its own weapon against a target inside what that government might consider an escalatory red line. The Flamingo carries no such restriction. It's Ukraine's missile, built on Ukrainian soil, launched on Ukrainian authority alone. That single fact reshapes the strategic calculus for every future strike package Kyiv plans. A common assumption circulating in defense commentary after this strike was that the Flamingo's accuracy must be inferior to Western precision-guided systems, given Ukraine's comparatively limited domestic guidance technology base. The evidence tells a different story. Post-strike imagery showed impact precision in line with comparable Western cruise missiles, a result Ukrainian engineers attribute to a guidance architecture built specifically to resist the kind of electronic warfare interference that has degraded other systems' accuracy in this theater. 3 targets destroyed, a radar gap exposed, and then quietly closed by Russian redeployment within 48 hours. But the targeting cell that planned this operation wasn't done. Ukrainian sources later indicated this strike was the first of what defense officials described as a sustained campaign, with additional Flamingo operations following in the weeks after, hitting targets Russian air defense had assumed were simply out of reach. Russian state media, in the days following the strike, offered a muted response, brief acknowledgement of incidents at industrial and infrastructure sites, framed in language designed to minimize both the scale of damage and the implication that Russian air defense had been comprehensively outmaneuvered. Intercepted internal communications painted a less composed picture. Confusion in the immediate aftermath. Finger-pointing between regional air defense commands over which unit bore responsibility for the radar coverage gap, and at least one reported reprimand issued to officers responsible for the sector. The common version of events, repeated across some early commentary, framed this as primarily a symbolic strike, a demonstration of capability more than a militarily decisive blow. That framing undersells what actually happened. A satellite relay node feeding targeting data to active frontline operations doesn't get rebuilt in a weekend. A fuel depot supporting an armor staging effort doesn't get refilled instantly. These weren't symbolic targets. They were chosen because their loss imposed real, measurable friction on ongoing Russian operations at the front, hundreds of kilometers from where the missiles actually struck. There's a line in the publicly available damage assessment summaries that reads almost like a tactical post-mortem, written by the people it embarrassed. An acknowledgement that the radar coverage gap had been assessed as low priority prior to the strike. Low priority. 9 weeks of patient Ukrainian reconnaissance turned a low-priority assessment into the single costliest air defense failure that sector had experienced in months. Stay with me, because what happened in Russian command structures over the following weeks tells you almost as much about the long-term impact of this strike as the impact craters themselves. Russian military leadership, facing pressure to explain how 3 targets, 1,200 kilometers from the front, had burned in a single night, ordered a sector-wide review of radar coverage along comparable terrain features elsewhere on the western and southern approaches. That review, according to subsequent reporting, identified several additional gaps with similar characteristics, meaning the original seam Ukrainian planners exploited likely wasn't unique. It was simply the first one found, mapped, and used. The thing is, this strike wasn't supposed to work, not according to most pre-strike assessments of Ukraine's domestic long-range strike maturity. And yet it did, because it combined a genuinely capable new weapon system with old-fashioned patient intelligence work, the kind that doesn't generate headlines until the night it pays off. Subscribe to War Vector, because preparation defeats improvisation. In the weeks following the strike, Ukrainian defense officials confirmed continued production scaling for the Flamingo program, framing the December operation not as a one-off demonstration, but as proof of concept for a sustained long-range strike capability, independent of Western supply chains and authorization processes. For a war that has, since 2022, been heavily shaped by the pace and politics of foreign military aid, that independence is a genuine strategic turning point, one Russian planners will need to account for in every future calculation about which targets, at what distance, they can consider safe. What would NATO have done differently here? Watching from the outside, as a partner nation developed an independent long-range strike capability that sidesteps the usual authorization friction. Comment your analysis. So here's the tactical lesson at the heart of this operation. Air defense built around the assumption that the enemy's capability stays static is air defense built to fail the moment that assumption breaks. Russian command spent years calibrating its western and southern radar posture against drone swarms. Slow, predictable, exhausting, but ultimately manageable. The moment Ukraine introduced a low-flying, terrain-hugging cruise missile with genuine range and a warhead heavy enough to matter, that entire calibration went obsolete in a single night, against 3 targets, with 0 Ukrainian losses. The answer to our earlier question: Russian air defense registered exactly 1 anomalous radar contact across the entire operation, flagged by a junior operator roughly 4 minutes before the first impact. Far too late for any intercept to be mounted. The correct answer was C. Was proceeding with the launch despite the unexpected Russian patrol aircraft loitering near the staging area the right call, or did the targeting cell just get lucky on a decision that could just as easily have ended in disaster? Could Russian command have prevented this entirely with a more adaptive radar posture? Or was the terrain gap always going to be exploitable by someone, eventually, regardless of doctrine? And if you were the senior targeting officer facing that 23-minute window of uncertainty with the patrol aircraft circling nearby, what would you have done differently? Subscribe to War Vector. We break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The skies over those 3 sites are quiet now. Recovery crews finished their work weeks ago. The wreckage cleared, the official reports filed and buried, somewhere deep in a ministry archive in Moscow. But the radar gap that made this strike possible, or whatever new gap Russian engineers have since found while searching for it, remains the kind of vulnerability that doesn't announce itself until the night someone finds it. Modern warfare punishes tactical mistakes without mercy. Stay vigilant.